Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Back to the Office series, discussions of best practices surrounding returning to an office or lab-based work environment. Our final episode dives into the government perspective, featuring Loretta Beine of Empire State Development and Sue Rosenthal of New York City's Economic Development Corporation. This panel was moderated by Linda Malek of Moses and Singer, and here is episode 3 of NewYorkBIO's Back to the Office series.
All right. Good morning. I almost said afternoon. It feels like it's been that kind of week. Good morning, everybody. We'll give folks a minute or two to join, and then we'll get started. All right, we will get going. So good morning. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled that you're joining us either live or you're listening to this recording later for the third of our Back to the Office seminars. We spent earlier weeks talking about with life science R&D companies about the challenges that they faced returning their workforce to the office, because let's be honest, it's not back to work because everyone has continued to work. It really is about coming back into the office. And then last week we had a conversation with real estate people and entities, right, that host in New York City in particular. Obviously, we're much more vertical than other areas of the state. So we discussed the challenges in getting people back into offices in the city. And then this week we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from our economic development colleagues and their challenges, but I would argue many more successes despite COVID in making sure that our life science ecosystem not only stayed running, but also turned out literally life-saving vaccines and the testing capacity that we really needed to make sure that our people could continue to do their jobs. So with that, I would like to also remind you, please ask your questions during the conversation in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I'll help monitor those and hand them over to Linda Malek from Moses and Singer, who is our colleague today, who will be our moderator for the discussion. So thank you, Linda, so much for shepherding this discussion, and I will turn it over to you to introduce our guest.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Malek. I chair the healthcare and life sciences practice, as well as the privacy and cybersecurity practice at Moses and Singer, a law firm here in New York. And we were in issues around COVID response in the height of the pandemic. And I'm actually really looking forward to hearing from both Sue and Loretta with respect to their work in this area. The government in New York State and in New York City has been really incredible, I think, in terms of handling everything related to this pandemic and in planning for the future and in reopening and so on. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. With us, we have Loretta Beine, who is Senior Director of Business Development for Empire State Development, and Sue Rosenthal, who is the President for Life Sciences and Healthcare at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And thank you both very much for being here. I want to ask both of you, just in terms of level setting, to talk a little bit about the roles of both of your agencies in sort of the ecosystem of government as it relates to COVID, because when we think of government, we often think of government as sort of a monolith, and that's certainly not the case, particularly in New York. So could you each talk a little bit about your agency's roles and then your roles within the agency, and then we can go from there. Sue, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Linda. And thank you and NewYorkBIO and for having us here today. New York City Economic Development Corporation is generally responsible for economic development for New York City. And that is about putting in place different building blocks for industry growth and job growth and support for the different neighborhoods across the city. And so as part of that, we have specific industries that we have identified as opportunity for New York City that require government investment to help stand up and create growth and accelerate growth in the future. And life sciences and healthcare are industries that EDC has chosen to focus on amongst others. And so, Linda, to your question, EDC, when COVID started, it was a really large all hands on deck moment for all governments, whether that was at the city level, at the local level, at the state level, and federal. And so in when COVID started and the city formed its test and trace team, as well as teams related to the restaurant industry or different industries that were affected by COVID, EDC stepped in a number of ways. And that was everything from the use of the assets that we managed to support COVID activity that was needed from our healthcare response system. So that's everything from ambulance parking to development of test kits and supply chain for PPE. And ultimately, we also use the relationships that we have in life sciences, manufacturing, and technology, even in fashion and other industries, to bring together the sector to respond to COVID. And so that is in the form of manufacturing PPE. We also put together an actual testing lab to help provide more access to testing for New Yorkers. Ultimately, because health is central to economic development, and having access to that in an equitable way was very important to make sure that we had the tools we need to fight COVID. And so now moving forward, we're also talking about how do we learn from what we went through over the past 15 months or so, ultimately to stand up systems and infrastructure and innovation to prevent future pandemics and be able to respond to health emergencies more robustly. So that's generally what we had done during COVID. And as we're looking forward, we're also thinking about how do we support additional industry growth because it really does impact our ability to respond. But it also is such a resilient industry for the city that it can also prevent the impact in the future to the economy, to jobs, to people, ultimately in how they face future issues like this. Oh, Linda, you're on mute.
Thanks, Sue. Loretta, do you want to talk about Empire State Development in the same context?
Sure, that would be great. Thanks, Linda. And hello, everybody. So I wanted to also thank NewYorkBIO for inviting Empire State Development to participate in this panel. Basically, I'll just go backwards since Sue was talking about what EDC did during the height of the pandemic. I would say that ESD sort of paralleled what EDC was doing. Where we weren't collaborating, we were boosting. So in some ways we were looking for PPE. We also heard from a lot of fashion companies and sewers and people that worked in Broadway that made costumes, and they wanted to help us make, gowns and things for hospitals. So it was all hands on deck, and you can't be prouder of how New York handled the pandemic. And it's not the government I'm talking about necessarily, it's the citizens. So that was really great. And we learned a lot about our community, how well sectors and business and government and academia can partner. That was another example of us coming through sort of an emergency. So just to back up about the background for Empire State Development, we are New York State's Economic Development Agency. So one of the really great reasons to that I like my job is this agency is a sort of so we're not requiring people to do things. We're actually helping people run their business. So the way that we do that is through grants and tax credit programs to help incentivize businesses to make investments here in the state as opposed to somewhere else. And we also do a lot of work to try and attract business here to see the value of doing business in New York State. And we're great partners with EDC already, and we work with NewYorkBIO. So that's kind of our background.
Thanks, Loretta. I want to touch on a couple of things that each of you said during your introductory remarks. Let's start with the Excelsior Tax Credit Program, which you had alluded to, Loretta, in terms of the work that ESD did with respect to lifting some of the tax-related issues. Can you talk about that specifically?
So yeah, we have an Excelsior Jobs Tax Credit Program, and that's the name of it. And the reason why the state might use that program first before we go to grants or any other programs, it's because it's a refundable tax credit. So for even companies in life sciences that may not have a tax liability for years and years, they can take advantage of this program because the program acts like a grant. So if you don't have the tax liability, you get the money in terms in a check at the end of each calendar year of the program that you're involved in. So that's what's beneficial for technology businesses because they're not always making money first. So I think we want to probably get into the story of the money that New York State and New York City invested in life sciences industry. And that's one of the ways that this Excelsior program was able to enhance opportunities for life sciences companies. Before we launched that life sciences initiative investment, a company had to create 10 jobs in order to be eligible for the program. So now that we have these enhancements, a company only has to create 5 jobs, which makes a lot more sense for life sciences because they don't grow jobs fast and they have to be careful with their money. So that's one of the ways that program helped businesses in the state to actually get some incentives instead of doing it all on their own.
Yeah, and that has been, I think, for those that are familiar with it, a really impactful program. I want to also ask the two of you about life sciences specifically, because life sciences in the midst of the pandemic was, as it turned out, a really resilient part of the economy, I think. And I wanted to ask you both to speak to that and to talk also about how your organizations worked together to try to promote and enhance the survival of the life sciences community and to ensure its resilience in this context during the pandemic, and then maybe talk a little bit about what you're thinking about beyond the pandemic.
So I could start if that's okay.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, when the companies were being asked to shut down and businesses were being asked to close up, the regional offices throughout the state of New York was tasked with talking to companies who were saying, can I open up? Can I go to work? Can I run my operation? So one of the things that we did was help labs and manufacturers to be able to stay on the job, because if they don't do that, then we saw what it looks like when the world shut down. But we need those consumer goods to be passed through, and we need the research that's on a timeline. They have milestones they need to meet, and you can't just close a lab and preserve science, your research. So yeah, I think that we worked well with Sue's agency in finding companies that needed guidance through these issues. And maybe Sue, you have more to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think that was really great, Loretta. And at the core of everything that we do is safety. And that was not different in helping to keep businesses open during the pandemic. And Loretta's absolutely right. You can't simply just shut down an experiment and then start it back up without any losses for that science, for those experiments. And so it was really great to be able to talk with different agencies, different actors at the city and the state level to talk through what the different options were, and then also make sure that we were supporting safety as laboratories stayed open throughout the pandemic. And then, quite frankly, the industry itself was how we got through it. There were, I think about the lab that we set up with the pandemic response lab, and that was with a company that is based out of Brooklyn, called Opentrons, that works on laboratory robotics, and in partnership with NYU and the science that was developed for testing at NYU. I mean, that is the industry coming together with our health and hospital system and our team here at EDC and the test and trace team to figure out how do we take what we can do in science and actually deliver it as a product to help get through this together as a city. And so that it's a great example of why we're investing in this industry even more. Linda, to your question on the evolution towards the future, we saw not only was the industry the way we got through it in terms of providing the resources, the tools, the therapies, the vaccines to get through the pandemic, but we also saw that most companies, whether small in the incubators or larger in larger footprints, stayed open and grew. And we see funding is growing and more so every day, whether that's funding in the research or funding from the venture community. We, every week we get new announcements of companies that have raised more money or are taking spaces in the different developments across the city. And that story didn't change even during the pandemic. I'll take an example, a company that's showing itself as a darling of the city called Velastra that was in J Labs, and then recently took a footprint up in West Harlem. And that's an example of a great story. And we see, I see on their LinkedIn page, they post pictures of going to lunch in West Harlem. That's a great example of the industry not pausing and continuing to grow and thrive. And so as a city, we announced 2 weeks ago that we're actually doubling our investment in life sciences to $1 billion and to put in place more infrastructure and more space and programs and talent development to help catalyze that and accelerate that growth in New York City even more.
Thanks, Sue. That investment, I think, is kind of a key component of what hopefully will be growth and not just retention of businesses here, but growth of businesses here. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask both of you to talk a little bit about the city and state's investment in the economy, in real estate, in terms of allowing for entities in the life sciences and beyond to stay in New York, mm-hmm. and what that looks like, what you think the important components of investment are and support are in terms of recovery to help these entities both stay in New York and to attract other entities to New York.
I'm happy to start, Loretta, if you want. And, sure. So, I mean, I think there are a few things. There are some basic building blocks that we need to make sure are available to companies as they look to grow. So we need space that's ready for companies to move in. And if you had looked a few years ago, there were really a handful of options, very good options, but not enough options. And now as we're looking forward, we see spaces coming online that it won't be a question any longer of where can you go and is there enough space that's available within the next year or two. And so, we have visibility. By 2023, we have visibility to 3 million square feet coming online. So that's one of the building blocks. But when you think about company growth, what is core to company growth are people and talent. And New York City is one of the most incredibly dense talent pools of the world. And that's from across the region. And so what will attract companies and keep companies growing in New York is that feeling that talent is available. And part of that is having clusters where talent can meet each other and identify options for their career paths. And so when you think about successful life sciences clusters, there's a feeling of that talent that I'm going to go to company A because I'm excited about company A, but company A might be very early stage and might be risky. And I want to know that if I go to that company in that location, there will be other options as a backup strategy. And so our investments in developing clusters in different neighborhoods across New York City is ultimately to see a vision where to reach a vision of having that cluster feeling where you know that you might bump into somebody in a coffee shop, or you can go down the hallway to talk to another company, or up a flight of stairs and talk about, you know, how they file IND, or, you know, share, you know, hey, I have a job coming available for any of, you know, for people that might be interested. And so that's what we're really looking to reach, that critical mass in the city, and we're on our way. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the number of companies that we see in New York City is skyrocketing, and we're now in the hundreds as opposed to in the handfuls. And so that's great direction. But the investment that we're putting in is really to make sure that those campuses and those clusters are developing in a much more robust way.
Thanks.
Sort
Loretta,
of
do you want to weigh in on that too?
Sure. Yeah, there was a lot packed in that question, and there was a lot packed in Susan's answer, because we're on the upswing. And, you know, I hear people saying, is New York ever going to be Boston? And probably the answer is no, we're going to be better. But we're going to be our version of what life sciences is. And that has a lot to do with the infrastructure here in terms of the university systems, private and public, like SUNY across the state is the largest university system in any state. So what they can do is speak to one another and help researchers find assets and utilize equipment that maybe small businesses can't buy themselves, but we put together some incubators that might be, or centers of excellence that might be able to buy a piece of machinery or equipment that companies could use. Instead of them spending their money on those capital investments, they want to continue to spend the money on the people to do the research. And like Sue said, there's a lot going on in New York City, of course, to attract businesses. Those businesses need to attract employees, and the culture of New York City and New York State overall, with its dynamic, diverse business types. Like from New York City, you go from finance to theater to anything that you can think of. There are not a lot of technology jobs. So there's not only the job that is being attracted by a company, but the spouse's job is there. There's a lot of opportunities in different levels. So using the assets that exist, the transportation system, the laboratories in New York State, across the state. We have dozens of amazing laboratories right on Long Island. It's not necessarily in the life sciences, but in technology is Brookhaven National Labs. On Long Island is also Cold Spring Harbor Labs. New York City has New York Stem Cell Foundation, New York Genome Center. And then if you go out west, there's Roswell Cancer Center, and in Albany, Wadsworth. These labs make a difference. So when businesses are establishing, they might want to locate near, we're talking about that cluster, and that these labs aren't going away. There's the historic reference to all of those that will help build the cluster for smaller companies and being near the universities. So I'm not sure if I was redundant with what Sue was saying, but it's a proud story to tell, because there's a lot, you know, this isn't just happening now. This has been happening, you know, onward. I remember when Forest Labs was on Long Island, we went in and we asked them why they established, you know, in Suffolk County, Long Island, like what were you near besides potato farms? And they said the airport. So, you know, so everybody's looking for something, and they were looking for the airports, the access to Europe and other things at the two international airports in Queens. So there's always going to be, a want, and lots of times New York can fulfill that.
One thing that I want to highlight in terms of some of the things you've talked about in this particular context is that during the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about businesses leaving New York. New York is too expensive, and that extended to the life sciences industry to some extent as well. You both have talked about investment of resources, of money into this sector to try to, really continue these successes that we've been talking about before the pandemic. And I wonder whether each of you could talk a little bit more specifically about both the commitment that we see in terms of this recent announcement of investment, and also, what you think can be achievable, what you hope can be accomplished in terms of both bringing life sciences back to the extent that anyone has left, and continuing to grow it with this sort of perception that New York is too expensive right now. So Sue, I'll ask you to start with that.
Sure. So I think it would be really helpful to dispel a couple of things that we're hearing. So first, I think the pandemic, when it started, was terrible and had heavy impact on New York City. But what's interesting to observe is that the speculation in the beginning that New York City would not return to office, for example, we're actually seeing a lot less of a downside to that than we anticipated. And I mean, as you can see, I'm in the office right now, and I have loved coming back, and I think that's a sentiment that many have felt, and so I think that's a really important element to share. That there was a fear in the beginning of what might be, and that reality has not actually taken place in that way. So that's something that I think the opportunity for New York, it wasn't what was expected at the very beginning, and in fact, that's something that we're really excited about and seeing. I think some people did leave New York. The companies in life sciences, actually, the majority have either continued to thrive or grow. There have, of course, there's a handful that did not. I'm not sure if the reason companies did not survive was actually COVID related, in particular in life sciences, because the investment has continued to increase and labs were allowed to stay open, et cetera. So it's something that we're actually looking into now to learn more about, because we want to dispel it. If there is a myth out there about the industry being affected by COVID, we would like to make sure we have a data-driven answer for that, because our observation is actually the opposite. And so that's part of the reason, for investing more. I do think that there's one, and this is my personal belief, that we're evaluating in terms of how to position New York City. New York City is not for everyone, right? And I think New York City is a very special place. And some folks left during the pandemic, and I think there were either needs, New York City can accommodate all different types of needs at different stages of careers. And in fact, from a lab space perspective, is actually less expensive than from the rent fees are less expensive than Cambridge, for example, based on the data that we see now. And so from a lifestyle perspective, we know that New York City has a high cost of living relative to suburbs, but it also has benefits to it relative. It's just a different life. And so we think New York City has an incredible diversity of industries, as Loretta was saying earlier, and just is a very, very special place. And so that that isn't going to change. We will remain amazing as a city and grow. And part of being here is that resonates with the people that would be in New York City. So I don't necessarily feel that we should try to attract people that wouldn't be interested in New York City. I think there's room for the regional play for the industry and room for everyone to be both live and work and grow companies in places that that really resonates with that company and that those people. Loretta, what would you add to that?
So first, I would say to support the New York City initiative during this last 18 months, ESD has helped a couple of large headquarters to establish in New York City. And I think it's, they were coming from out of the state. And I think it's because there were real estate deals. So, you find the lemonade from the lemon. I don't know. I don't know if that normally would have happened, but having the low lease rates and having developers wanting to fill their buildings, this was one way to do it. So it's not necessarily, like I said, the life sciences business, but major global headquarters are to New York City. But I think maybe you were focused on the answer to the question, and it really is the real estate. It's real estate for accelerators, incubators, and even manufacturing. There's life sciences manufacturing going on in Brooklyn. You don't just have to go to out of New York City to find that it's beneficial for companies to do life sciences here in the state. Lots of times people will not use New York City region for manufacturing, but sometimes when the workforce is there or the access or even just the plan to grow and they want to be near their headquarters or their lab, you find that happening here. And it's really unique. And I think that that investors and developers decided to build out life sciences space is the answer to attracting businesses here or enabling the businesses that established in New York or spun out of some university or hospital. I think that's why they're going to be able to stay, because the real estate opportunity has now come to a reality.
And Linda, if I could add one other point that Loretta, you sort of jogged my mind on it a little bit of. I mentioned earlier the regional talent play, and we recently talked to a number of CEOs of New York City-based companies, and we asked, why are you in New York? What drove your decision to be in New York City? And some of them specifically over the last 15 months have chosen to be here. And some of it was, proximity to their scientists and their research institutions. Some of it was, Loretta is a very good point of taking advantage of some of the market dynamics. But ultimately, the most important part that they raised was that when they are bringing new talent on board, new people into their team, they feel very strongly that there's a very specific, I will call it hustle of New Yorkers, of New York talent. And that is something that they feel there's a hunger for growing companies, for growing, whether it's the science or the commercial opportunity or finding the funding that they feel is very special and unique to the New York talent pool. And so they have chosen to locate in New York City or expand in New York City because they know they'll have access to that. And so that's something that we were thrilled to hear and is something that we want to build on as we position the city moving ahead.
I think that's why we see the IT sector growing too. Software IT, and there's a lot of opportunity there now. A company that normally wouldn't have such a huge IT department now has selling online and things like that. So yeah, I think that's why even not just IT and life sciences, but across the board.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it really is important to emphasize these points, because these are issues and questions that have come up a lot, and I think it's important to both reemphasize the commitment on the part of New York City and state government, but also maybe dispel some of the myths that we hear. I want to pivot a little bit to some general questions with respect to, returning to work safely. And we've received a question about that I want to just read out. That question is, what have companies done to create office/lab space that employees felt safe coming back to? And is this changing now with high vaccination rates? Are these measures being maintained long term? Are employees or tenants worried about a fall, winter COVID resurgence? And understanding that your organizations are not at the forefront of decision making with respect to this, perhaps you can answer this question just from the vantage point of how you work with the City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the State Department of Health, and your coordination with them.
Sure. So I think one of the key elements for making sure companies and employees feel comfortable with coming back to work is making sure that resources are available for what one would need. So that could be as simple as making sure not as simple, it's not so simple, to make sure our testing infrastructure is in place and that our vaccination infrastructure is in place. And so making sure that we are continuing to make those resources available to employees, to employers, and that there are continued discussions about what's required in terms of social distancing, in terms of PPE, and then making sure those resources are available. So there's always ongoing discussion about what the right recommendations might be, and following. Working with the State Department of Health, working with the CDC and federal agencies to understand and then disseminate the information that employers and employees need to have to be able to feel both comfortable coming back to work, as well as be able to have the tools in place to know what to do. I think to the question of are folks worried about the fall winter COVID resurgence? I think we have to continually monitor, right? We've not been through something like this before, specifically in the times that we're in now. I mean, we've certainly had pandemics in the past, but the times we're in now with the technology and the way we are open to travel and things like that is new relative to other pandemics. And so, that's something that we, of course, the Department of Health and the various health agencies are monitoring. I think we have to see how will it work with potential need for booster shots, and how even starting to think ahead about the flu season coming up and what may be different this coming year versus previous years. And so with the higher vaccination rates, I think we're in a really good position. We're very proud of how New Yorkers and how our agencies and partners have helped manage this pandemic. We have to keep vigilant to that and keep safety at the forefront. But because of the work that we've all done and the steps every individual has taken to help minimize the impact, we're in a very good position to actually get back to some new feeling of normal and being together, which I think is wonderful to see, and we hope continues.
That was really well said, because that's really what everybody did. So you had the burden of population being EDC with, a large city population in neighborhoods and subsectors. And so even in smaller regions, upstate in the North Country or out in Western New York, EDOs got together to make sure that their businesses and their hospitals and their emergency centers like firehouses and things like that had the PPE that they needed. And, that's a testimony to collaboration and New Yorkers too. But overall, we're looking at the idea that, we did this in the state of emergency. We started from scratch. We didn't have a plan necessarily. Like, we're not really proud of that, but, so the fact that we developed and got this far, this fast, if something else happens, we're more ready. So we're taking this as a more of a learning experience. We're taking all the positives out of this, where we know it was a crisis, and it still is for some people, you know, suffering in different ways, the sickness or from the loss of jobs, and so many things to look at. But basically, we're finding that New York State had an opportunity for companies to purchase rapid testing programs that would reduce the cost for businesses to test their employees, even school districts and things like that. We were giving grants to help them to buy the equipment, whether it was thermometers or that Abbott rapid testing machine. So we're finding that people aren't taking us up on that anymore. Where in the beginning there were, you know, hundreds of applications and they didn't all accept the grant, but now there's less than dozens of applications in the mix. So you know, I think that the strategies, the social distancing, everything everybody did to be safe and careful and smart. And it's not just that we're bored with staying home. I think that we're on the other side. The numbers show it. I'm not gonna, like you said, we're not the Department of Health, so I'm not gonna represent any numbers or anything like that. But the idea that I'm seeing reductions in applicants and things like that, I feel like people are on the mend, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that that sort of goes to what you both have touched on with respect to continual monitoring of the situation, because this is evolving daily. And as the data comes in, the responses in terms of what to do moving forward change. And where we were really focused on testing, it's interesting, Loretta, in terms of what you're talking about with respect to grant applications, sort of falling off because vaccine rates have increased and the vaccines so far seem to be holding with respect to variants as we are currently experiencing them. And, you know, that may of course change. Another question that we've received.
Actually, Linda, before you go to that though, I do think there's a really important trade-off that we're now at a very good place for balancing because of those vaccines, which is, you know, we see the impact of restrictions on mental health, on business activity, on education, and so you know that because we have access to incredible vaccines, it makes sense to have that balance help open the activity to minimize the impact in other ways, socioeconomically, equitably, education, you know, all of that. So you know, I think the point of, yes, we all have to continue to remain vigilant and do what we should do to protect the safety and the health of everyone. At the same time, part of that is engaging in safe ways with reopening. And so, you know, that's why of course, we will need to monitor, to your point about variants and vaccine durability of response. Given that, as long as that continues, part of you know, part of society is to continue to help open up and come back to some semblance of normal, because you know, there's downside risk of from all of those other things I mentioned that we have to really try to minimize, and really help create bring life back in a way that is healthy and productive. So I just wanted to make that point, because I do think we should and we do lean into, let's make sure that we're controlling the pandemic and mitigating that risk, but we also need to balance that out with a number of other risk factors to not just the economy, but to our health as well.
Well, let's delve into that just a little bit more, because I think those
Sure.
are points before we go to the next question. Sue, you had mentioned earlier on when you talked about the city's investment, concerns about making sure that to the extent that there is support being provided and investment being provided for reopening, that it's being provided equitably. So yeah, we're talking about issues around reopening to try to alleviate some of the mental health issues that we experienced and the economic issues. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that have also been taken into account? For example, when we talk about reopening equitably, childcare is
Mhm.
an issue. What kinds of things have been considered in terms of investment? Is that one of them?
Yeah. So, wow, did we learn a lot in this past 15, 16 months or so? I think it's 16 now. Um, we, so, so first off, during the pandemic, the point I made earlier about making sure there were access to resources, I'm so proud of our city, of our state for what we made available. I know that it certainly, as Loretta was saying earlier, there was quite a shock in learning about first off our response and what we needed to do, but also seeing the inequities that happened and that have not, quite frankly, I don't think, I mean, I know are not new. It's something that we've been trying to think about how do we address, but it have unfortunately we saw it so starkly that in moving ahead, it's have it as the center of every activity that we do and every project that we invest in. But the thing that I'm very proud about is that at one point during the pandemic, when I looked at, I worked very closely on testing for the city, and so this is very near and dear to my heart. But we looked across the testing options, and unfortunately for the whole country, COVID at the time, and this was throughout the fall and into the winter, and it started in the summer. The turnaround times for testing were abysmal. It was almost as if testing was just not it was not a useful thing to have a result from a test 7 to 10 days ago. And so but in the city, we had set up testing infrastructure in such a way that we had driven the amount of testing that was available, the locations where testing was available, to the point where while other locations across the country were still having these issues, you could go to any H&H testing site and have results within 24 hours. And that's an example where testing was made available, and also even in partnership with the state, we had rapid tests become more available. And so that was something where there was accessibility, also learning things like when you offer tests you have to make sure they're available to populations of all backgrounds. Undocumented individuals, for example, may not have an email or a phone number to get results delivered to them, but we made sure that we had mechanisms in place for those results for people to be tested and to have results regardless of background, and that you would not have to pay for it. We didn't want that to be a barrier either. So it's a source of pride for me personally that our city and our state made sure that it did not matter if you could pay for it, or if you whatever your background was, you had accessibility to this specific tool. And so we need to do more things like that. And to your point, we also learned, unfortunately, that women saw an increasing hardship throughout the pandemic in continuing to work, and I should say women and men, quite frankly. It's not just women in terms of childcare and family care, and the impact of that on maintaining a job or progressing in a job was quite high. And so EDC actually has formed a childcare team as part of its efforts to, and we're in a diligence phase now where we're doing quite a bit of research on policies and activities and what we can do, knowing that is a barrier to equity. And so that's something that we're looking at in the future. And I anticipate, we know we have a lot of work to do on many different levels. We also have embedded into our life sciences activities consideration for, how do we make sure that we are closing the gaps in equity that exist in this industry. And so, sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I was very proud of that one example of accessibility. And it's something that we should be aiming to do across all of the activities we do.
And it was totally the human side of the story, really. So thank you for that information. And I just wanted to say I have a statistic since February. Over 40,000 individual rapid tests have been conducted under our programs at 70 testing locations across the entire state. So if that's in the state, you could imagine what the density of New York City was doing, having that, your own initiative going out and doing those rapid testing. So you probably have a number similar to that where we're across the entire state, but you had to, deal with what was happening in Manhattan and the 5 boroughs. So it's exciting. I also wanted to mention something about, we talked about the Excelsior Jobs Tax Credit program earlier. So there have been enhancements made to that program over the years, and childcare is one of them. So for example, if you're an applicant and you're receiving Excelsior tax credits, there is a component for you to apply for additional funds to enhance your childcare program or to establish a childcare program, because there's nothing better than not dropping your child somewhere that is much farther away from you. If you can have something near your office or in your office or in your operation, it's not always an office. We know that as a fact, we're all women know that as a fact, that that's more useful to families than to drop their children, some miles away from where they're working.
And Linda, Loretta, I think that's fantastic. Loretta, you also jogged my memory on one more thing just now, if you don't mind, Linda. So we learned a lot, but we still have more learning to do. And one of our projects moving forward is to stand up a pandemic response institute. And so the reason I bring that up is because the vision for it is really to make sure we're bringing together the public sector, the private sector, community business organizations, and other actors into a forum and with specific activities and engagement to be able to more deeply build the network that we need so that in the future, if we are encountering health emergencies, we are more richly able to address them with communities of all backgrounds and just have that network set up to not skip a beat in the future when something comes forward to us, and to have and to not see those outcomes, close those gaps in disparities of treatment, of connectivity, of trust, that we really need to get better at.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Sue, because that was actually something that I was going to ask about. I think both of you have hit on some really important themes in terms of what we've learned and how we're going to incorporate that into what we do going forward. These issues in terms of equity, in terms of disparities, in terms of safety, and in terms of economic impact, I think are all really important ones. And it sounds as though the Pandemic Response Institute, as well as the tax credit program that the state has initiated and is continuing, will all be, really important functions of how we incorporate all of those issues and deal with them going forward. One thing I did want to touch on in terms of a question that came in was something that you had mentioned, Loretta, with respect to the COVID testing and the proliferation of sites all over the state. And one question that has come in is, what type of COVID testing will remain on an ongoing basis? Right now, we're seeing a decline in cases, but not knowing what that will look like in the fall and the winter. Is there, to your knowledge, discussion around COVID testing going forward? And, again, keeping in mind that this is probably coming more out of the governor's office than the Department of Health, but to the extent that you have knowledge about that or thoughts about that, could you share those?
Yeah, so briefly, we do see that the need for tests are going down with the vaccinations, and people can carry the Excelsior pass in their wallet, which they could have it electronically, or a card that says that you were vaxxed or whatever. We saw lately, like, so the Mets 2 days ago had their first 100% attendance. So things like that, I think people are more willing to go out and do things, and the testing is not part of getting in anymore, where we were thinking that people were going to need to be tested even to go to weddings or to go to different social functions, not just public functions like, sports and theater and things like that. But I think, that we're not putting that away. Those thoughts and ideas are going to be present. So if there is an uptick in numbers or if things change, but right now, the numbers are going in the right direction. So Sue even said it, that we've learned from this so that the next time something happens, we're not starting from scratch and we have tools to move forward. And it doesn't have to be the same exact scenario for us to build on what we learned. So you're right. The answer wouldn't come from my agency necessarily, more the governor's office and the Department of Health. But basically, I see the other side. I see people going places, and the only thing that we see being really pushed is vaccines, trying to get everybody vaccinated.
Right, which is obviously an important one. There's one last question that we did not touch on that I want to just touch on briefly, and it was around how the city and state collaborated with the academic medical center community in terms of treating COVID patients and staying open for the research that they do. And again, to the extent that each of you had some involvement in that, could you speak to that?
Sure. Why don't I kick off? So when COVID began and we realized there were testing challenges to supply chain, we actually brought together an academic council. We called it the Testing Innovation Council, that had members from a number of the institutions across the city: Columbia, Rockefeller, Memorial Sloan Kettering, et cetera. That group was a set of advisors with us as we worked on various different testing activities and worked with EDC, with Health and Hospitals, with the Department of Health, and the broader Test and Trace team, and were very instrumental as we thought about both the different testing strategies and the volume that we were aiming for, and how to access that volume, whether either building or expanding testing in the city. And then also about evaluating technologies and different types of tests and all the different nuances therein, whether it's a type of a swab or a testing data, or whether you need to do different steps of the scientific approaches to testing. And so they were instrumental in helping us think through that. And then in the fall, another example, and this is just, how we've connected with the institutions. But in the fall, as we started to see in December, actually, the UK variant was the start of bringing together all of the academic institutions of the city, and that not just the academic institutions and universities, but even some of the partners in various different companies that were doing surveillance through genetic sequencing of COVID, and bringing everybody together and sharing data and talking about the variants and talking about what their implications might be. And we brought everybody together to talk through that, and then have continually met with those institutions, again, with the Department of Health as the center of that, to make sure that we are monitoring for the city what we're doing, and also talking about, let's not all study the same thing, so that we can actually strategize about and share both data and learnings and findings to help explore what we need to learn about both COVID and the various different variants that are happening.
And Loretta,
we also worked with hospitals in terms of buying consortium and purchasing consortiums. So to get PPE and all the other things that they needed to operate. And then a problem we didn't know we were going to have, a place for them to store the PPE that they had to keep on hand. So yeah, it's good collaboration.
And one, I'm just going to give a huge shout out to the health department at Wadsworth, because all of this would not have been possible if they hadn't been available and open, working with us through all the different projects that we had worked on. It's not something you could just, snap your fingers and start a lab. There is very appropriate oversight and rules and regulations. And in this emergency, the Wadsworth team was just incredible as we were working through this.
Yeah, and I can actually reiterate that too, because those of us in the private sector that were working on behalf of clients with Wadsworth found them to be just incredibly responsive, flexible, and helpful. So thank you to both of you for this panel discussion. I think this was really insightful, really helpful, and I want to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Loretta. What an amazing, not only a discussion, but also the picture that emerges when none of us would have chosen to have to collaborate the way that we have and produce over the last 16 months. But I, for one, am very thankful that you all were on the job on behalf of New Yorkers and New York companies. So thanks for bringing that story forward today for our audience. So we really appreciate your contributions, not only today, but to our entire life science ecosystem. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in person very soon at a New York Bio event. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on New York Bio's Back to the Office series. For more from New York Bio, follow us on Twitter @NewYorkBio and check out our website at www.newyorkbio.org.